This is a Level 2 lesson over Cells and Organisms, Step 4. During this lesson, you will learn about the following terms: unicellular, multicellular, eukaryotic, prokaryotic, and specialized cell. Let's talk about the difference between multicellular and unicellular organisms. Unicellular organisms are made of one cell. These cells have everything that they need in order to carry out life. So they have structures that allow them to move. They have structures that allow them to get food, reproduce, and respond to the environment. An example of a unicellular organism would be a bacteria. Multicellular organisms are organisms made of many cells. In multicellular organisms, these cells work together to help keep the organism alive. As you might know, you are an example of a multicellular organism, along with things like fungi, which are mushrooms, and trees, which are part of the plant kingdom. Here is a slide with images of unicellular organisms. So these are some examples. In the center, there's an amoeba, a paramecium, and a euglena. To the right, there are yeast cells, so they're unicellular. Below the yeast cells are a real image of a paramecium. And then at the bottom left, there are bacteria cells. So these are just some examples of unicellular organisms. There are lots of them out there. Here are some examples of multicellular organisms. So we have trees, brine shrimp, fleas, turkeys, and worms. Multicellular organisms, sometimes you might need a microscope to see them. You always need a microscope to see unicellular organisms. So just because you need a microscope to see an organism, it doesn't necessarily make them unicellular. Let's talk about the difference between a eukaryotic cell and a prokaryotic cell. Prokaryotic cells mean that they do not have structures surrounded by a membrane. And so what happens is the important structures like DNA, which are the blueprints of a cell, they just float around inside the cell. They're not surrounded by something that protects them. They float freely. Prokaryotic cells are a little bit more primitive or immature compared to eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells are a little bit more evolved, and so they have all of their cell parts in different places. They have them organized a little bit more. So the parts are bound by a membrane or a wall. And so we'll talk about some examples here. Prokaryotic cells, like I said, they're primitive or they're not as evolved as eukaryotic cells. So an example would be bacteria and archaea. These are bacteria or types of organisms that live in very extreme environments like hot springs, so very dark, hot places where most of the time things can't live. There are certain types of unicellular organisms that can live in those types of environments. Eukaryotic cells are, like I said, cells that are a little bit more evolved, and so you are made out of eukaryotic cells. All of your cells have membrane-bound structures. And there's an example at the bottom left-hand corner that shows the difference between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell. So animal cells and plant cells are considered eukaryotic, where things like bacteria are considered prokaryotic. Yeast is actually eukaryotic, even though it's a unicellular organism. Specialized cells. So you can see there are a couple of pictures up here that might give you a hint as to what specialized cells are. Specialized cells, you'll only find them in multicellular organisms, for one, and they do a certain job. So as you know from studying the body systems, a neuron or a nerve cell has a very specific job. It just sends and receives messages. animals aren't the only thing that has specialized cells in them. Plants also do too. So for example, root cells have hair-like structures that absorb water. And so that is the role of a root cell. So each specialized cell works with similar cells to carry out a job. So neurons work with other neurons in order to transmit and receive messages throughout the body. Specialized cells also allow multicellular organisms to do many more things than a unicellular organism can do. So that's one of the reasons we can somewhat multitask. Some examples of specialized cells, and these are just a few examples. In plants, it could be a root cell. In animals, it could be things like nerve cells and blood cells.